This is the story of a college student named Yuya, who had been summoned by a goddess and only hoped for the typical no-brainer ending of every isekai hero tale, where he'd return to his boring life after defeating the dragon she had summoned him to defeat. After he was forced to stay back and defeat another evil god, the goddess finally let Yuya return to his world, but insisted that he complete his farewell ritual first. Yuya reported his victory to the royal family and celebrated with his comrades, but as he packed his bags, a furry burst into tears because she couldn't bear to watch him go. It was understandably difficult for her because Yuya and his party members rescued her after she lost her family to bandits, and Yuya formed a part of the second home she ever knew. A maid, Eris, informed him that the preparations for the ritual were complete, and also expressed her disappointment at the fact that Yuya would be leaving without fulfilling her wishes. Following that, the king begged Yuya to stay back and even offered him his flat as a whiteboard daughter, the second princess, and her maid. Also, the crown prince Leon, along with his younger brothers, solemnly bade Yuya farewell because he was like a brother to them. Before leaving, Yuya's final request was for the royal family to take good care of Tia. After that, he met with the princess, Saint Mel, who thanked him for sacrificing his own life to save her world and swore to protect what he had so dearly fought for with her life. Even though she had hoped to get cozy with him before letting him go, she accepted what was and bade him farewell before performing the rite of return. In a few seconds, Yuya found himself back in his world and found out that the goddess had returned him to the exact date and time that he had left, as she had promised. Since he was in school, he decided to head home, but on the way, a girl named Akin, who had been his friend from childhood, called out to him. She noticed he was acting weird and almost like a different person, but Yuya tried to dismiss her worries. However, she was under the suspicion that he was weird because he now had a girlfriend, but with the same mouth she accused him of having one, she cursed him jokingly, saying he had been doomed to die single since he had an allergy to aura. However, he reminded her she didn't have a boyfriend either, and decided he was gonna grab lunch and head home as he had originally intended. Akin followed him to grab lunch, but still noticed more strangeness in his behavior and a coincidental change in his physique, as he looked 10 times hotter than the formless pig she had always known. Yuya suggested that perhaps she had fallen for him, but that immediately disgusted her so much that she wanted to pop his eyes with a can. However, she surprisingly noticed that tears were dripping down his face and asked him why he was crying, but the idiot blamed it all on mustard, even though she wouldn't buy it. Finally arriving at his home, Yuya was glad to find his home exactly as he recalled. Unfortunately, no one was there because his mom was on the night shift, his sister was at her school club, and his dad had moved away for his job somewhere on a different continent. As he opened the door of his dark room, he turned on the light but noticed, quite strangely, that he had unconsciously used a familiar hand motion to create light, and that only meant one thing. He had returned to his world with his magical powers. Yuya was shocked and confused at the discovery that he could still use magic, so he tried out other forms of magic, such as fire and wind magic, which both worked successfully, just as the light magic had. He remembered the gift his parents gave him for getting into college and tried appraising it with his magic, but disappointedly realized that he had been scammed with a fake Roly. At the same time, Yuya confirmed that he could still access his status window, and the inventory window still worked. He realized that he hadn't returned the holy sword belonging to the kingdom he had saved. Again, Yuya realized that his own life was the exact opposite of every typical isekai story out there. He had expected that after returning to his world, he would lose his powers, forget everything that happened, and live a happy life, but that was the exact opposite of what he was experiencing. At first, he was just chilling as a college student when he was summoned by Saint Mel, and then the goddess talked him into doing her dirty work. He spent a whole year training in both martial arts and magic, and with the help of his comrades, wiped the floor with the Demon King. However, the mastermind turned out to be the evil god Vilio, and Yuya still took him down. Everything he had done led him to his current situation, and he was completely clueless about why he still had magic, so he could only assume that the stupid goddess was playing some trick again. But since he couldn't ask her, he could never know for sure. Even if he wanted to restrain himself from using magic, he had gotten so used to performing his daily activities with magic in the other kingdom. So since he couldn't change anything, he decided to make sure at least that no one found out. Coincidentally, his sister, Ayumi, popped into his room to ask for lunch. She also noticed that he seemed different, although she blamed it on cheap crack. In the morning, Yuya decided not to attend lectures but to walk deep into the mountains so he could take a break from school and be somewhere he wouldn't be seen. He also noticed that he had been hiking at a pretty fast pace, but seemed not to be tired and blamed his body for malfunctioning. However, he accidentally created a huge crack in the ground when he kicked it lightly, and at that point, he was questioning whether he was human at all. He cast a fire spell, an ice spell, and a water spell, and all three worked normally. Next, he tested his inventory and found that it worked, as it had provided him with his holy sword. Finally, he tried to summon a familiar, and it worked, bringing forth his very first familiar, a shadow wolf that could understand the human language. Since he was done testing his summon feature, he let his wolf return and walked into town. On the way, he realized he needed some clothes but was super broke, so he went to purchase a scratch lottery. The salesgirl presented him with 3 lottery tickets, and he used his appraisal skill to estimate their worth. Afterwards, he picked one that had 50,000 worth of yen and cashed out his win. In his heart, Yuya felt like he was a low-key thief, although he couldn't blame himself for possessing magical powers. On his way out, he saw Akin together with a girl, Nana, both of whom were trying to shrug some idiots off their shoulders. When the girls spotted Yuya, Akin hid behind him, so one of the fools challenged him, asking him what the heck his problem was and why he was getting in their way. However, Yuya checked the guy's status and found that his stats were embarrassingly low, even for a prototype loser. He told the boys to be good and brought out some weird object, which he placed in his hands, squishing it in front of their eyes. He then told them to leave the girls alone, and they instantly left. But instead of being happy, Akin glared at him and asked him what he did. All Yuya told her was that he explained the situation to the boys, and they were super understanding. But when she refused to believe him, he told her that he had given the boys the name of someone who was quite notorious, and that was what scared them off. She finally let him off the hook, and both girls offered to go shopping with him. Afterwards, they had fun shopping, and he treated them to dinner. But on their way home, they noticed that someone had been hit in a vehicle accident. Yuya immediately told Ayumi and Nana to call the police and an ambulance, while Akin should keep an eye on the driver. He rushed to attend to the victim and used his magical skill, Conceal Presence, which made him invisible and unnoticeable to anyone. Unfortunately, the people around the victim were taking pictures instead of helping her, even though she was unconscious. He noticed she had a skull fracture, but there was no apparent wound damage, so he could still help her. Even though he couldn't heal her completely, he could make the wounds less deep so they wouldn't scar, and so he used his heal feature. Afterward, she twitched, and he reassured her that everything would be okay and that the ambulance would soon arrive. He lifted his console presence still, but was looking for Akin when he noticed her yelling at the driver. The idiot claimed he was still recovering from shock from the accident, but she ordered him to call an ambulance because the other victim was in an unconscious state. But when the idiot told her to mind her business, Yuya couldn't hold himself any longer and jerked up the guy by his collar, pointing out how dumb and irresponsible he sounded. Akin begged him to let him go, after which the ambulance finally arrived. When it was all over, they bid each other goodbye, but as he left, Akin seemed to have more to tell him but told him not to mind her. Later, Nana asked her what she planned to say to him, and Akin pointed out that there was a strange light around Akin when he was helping the accident victim. Nana said she wasn't looking at Yuya when he was helping the girl, and that Akin might have just been seeing things. Nevertheless, Akin stood by what she saw in her own mind. In that moment, Nana praised Yuya in his absence for looking so cool, and she asked Akin to gist her all about that hug. Flustered, Akin denied ever hugging Yuya, but Nana couldn't be easily convinced and even invited her over for a sleepover so she'd spill the tea. The next day, Yuya noticed that his shirt was still too tight, and all he wanted to do was rip it off. It had been 2 days since the accident, and the girl who had been hit had to be admitted for some days in the hospital, although she would be allowed to resume school the following week. The driver who hit her was unfortunately let go because he was sober at the time of the accident. To deliver justice in his own way, Yuya cursed the guy, bestowing upon him the curse of diarrhea whenever he would ever get excited. Anyway, it was time for him to put everything behind him, as he would be attending his part-time job. He showed up, and the manager asked him to work the front. It had been 2 weeks since his last shift in that role, but in reality, it had been over 3 years for Yuya, so he wondered if he could still do the job. However, his manager was losing her mind over the fact that he was shirtless, claiming it was because his work clothes didn't fit him anymore. The lady trembled as she selected a shirt from the pile. Although in her head, Mizu only wondered when Yuya became so ripped. Later, he worked hard at his job, but even Mizu could tell he was putting in so much effort. This was all thanks to the fact that Yuya's body was stronger, and he could actually do more than he could before. While he was working, one guy and his gang got too rowdy, so Mizu told them to tone it down and refrain from bothering the other customers. However, the guy said the place was practically empty, and there was no reason for him to keep quiet. So Yuya stepped in, saying that if they couldn't keep the noise down, he would politely ask them to leave. The idiots claimed customers were always right and deserved to be served, but Yuya said their restaurant didn't have time to serve losers, and as such, the bozo and his puppets should get out. The fool asked if Yuya was looking for a fight, so he simply activated his intimidation skill, and all of them staggered backwards, losing their loud mouths and confidence after only one look from Yuya. Thereafter, he handed them their bill, and they politely settled immediately, swaying away like the wasted fools they were. Mizu later asked him if they had done anything to him, and then started crying, saying she should have been the one to take care of them. However, he told her everything turned out fine, and he would only have to go clean up their little mess. Ever since Yuya returned to his world, he had been bored and quite exhausted, so he walked into the woods and in a cave met a dragon who was his familiar. Earlier that day, Yuya had wondered about what to do with his sacred blade, the weapon he had been given by the king when he was a hero. Before leaving their world, he wanted to give it back before returning to Japan but forgot it in his inventory. Even though he had dealt with the biggest threats, which were the evil god and the demon king, there were still little tiny demons roaming about here and there. However, Yuya knew he wouldn't be able to use it much in his own world, so he planned to return it at all costs. He later walked into the forest, remembering that he had earlier summoned his wolf, who seemed to have returned to the other side, so he planned to return the sword blade by summoning someone else. In the same location where he summoned the wolf, he summoned Layla, his familiar, who was a dragon. Layla was upset with her master for returning to his world, but was surprised that his summoning magic could reach across worlds. She asked what he had summoned her to do for him, and so he said that he had borrowed something but forgot to return it back, and he would like her to help him return it to the royal palace in Ariana's. Yuya wasn't comfortable sending her on that errand because Layla preferred to avoid interacting with humans, being the enemy of all social introverts. Most of his familiars he made by forming a contract with them by besting them in battle, but Layla's contract wasn't an average contract, but rather an initially beneficial relationship through summoning and exchange of information. Obviously, he couldn't order her to do anything and could only ask nicely. She said she had no issue helping him but wanted something in return, which was that she wanted to see his world for herself and experience it with her own eyes. However, Yuya said there was no issue, only that her form might be a problem. Surprisingly, Layla transformed into her human version, shocking Yuya with the size of those planets, and all he wanted her to do was shake them to the max. Before embarking on their exploration journey, Yuya warned her not to let anyone know she was from another world, because the inhabitants of this world were unaware of other worlds. She hopped on his bike and experienced the beautiful, smooth roads of Japan and took in its stunning scenery, thanks to the advancements in technology. She also couldn't get enough of the food, especially cake parfaits, and if she had to burn down a kingdom or two to get those, she wouldn't think twice. He begged her not to eat like she had 10 stomachs because he was just a broke college student. However, she asked him if she could give him one of her scales so he could sell it for money. In the end, he had to drag her out of the place, and since she had had her fun, Yuya said it was time for them to go, as he had to attend lectures. However, the girl said she would join him in class, but Yuya was obviously not comfortable with the idea, so she decided to explore the town while waiting for him. However, when he realized that she could spend his entire generation's savings and his trust fund, he decided to allow